Hi everybody, I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Admiral Rob Bauer, who is the chair of the Military Committee of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Admiral Bauer, good to see you. You're the highest ranking military official in NATO, is that correct?
I am. It's great to be here. Talking to you, Diane.
Let's start with the basics. What is the state of NATO today in terms of, we've certainly seen threats with regard to what's happening in Europe. Give us a temperature check.
I think as a result of the war, NATO is in a much stronger position. But it started a little bit earlier. It started basically after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, when in the military, the chiefs of defense started to think about a new military strategy. And for the first time in many decades, we talked about, the thinking was based on the fact that we saw Russia and international terror groups as a threat. Mm-hmm. Russia was a partner until fairly recently, basically until the summit in Madrid, when in the new strategic concept, we now talk about Russia as a threat. So on the political level, basically 4 years later than in the military, that was sort of embraced by the political level. And it was important that we started thinking about Russia as a threat, because as a result of everything that has happened since basically 2008, when the Russians attacked Georgia, 2014 Crimea and the Donbass region, and in 2022 the rest of Ukraine, we have to refocus again on collective defense. For many decades, we were looking at, okay, there's no real threat anymore to the alliance. So then we started to look at crisis response operations, conflicts somewhere else, further away in the world. And the idea was
as a backup, basically NATO as a backup.
Well, the idea was the let's say the international terrorism. If you can prevent it from traveling from Afghanistan, Iraq to Europe or the United States, then that is a good thing. Keep it there. But basically, that in itself, not necessarily for all sorts of reasons, has been too successful. Probably whilst we were doing it, it was, but it wasn't enduring enough. And we now realize we have to refocus on collective defense again as a result of what is happening. Because the Russians basically have told the world they want to go back to the borders of 1997. Which means that the nations that have since then become a member of NATO would become part of a barrier around, a buffer zone around Russia. That's what Putin wants. So it is not only about Ukraine, this war. This is about going back to ambitions that are much larger than that.
I don't want to go back into, get the whole history, but one of the factors that people talk about is that fear of Ukraine joining NATO. When you think about the structure of NATO, it's hard to talk, and maybe it's not your position to talk about a post, ideally an environment in which there's some sort of détente between Russia and Ukraine. But what is the likely scenario for what NATO looks like in Europe? From where, is that something NATO has talked about at this point?
Well, actually, the Secretary General has said that Ukraine's position is in the Euro-Atlantic family, and is in NATO.
Right.
And
so
he
that's
said it
now
fairly
a fait
recently.
accompli, right?
But of course, everybody understands that now, when the war is ongoing, that is not going to happen soon. And there's some other issues that need to be solved when you become a member. I mean, if you want to become a member of the alliance, there's a number of things you have to show, have to prove that you have arranged it. And you have to tick those boxes, so to say. And that has not happened yet. But you cannot be in a conflict when you become a member. So.
Right.
That is also part of the issue now. But I think it is extremely important to understand that the Ukrainian armed forces, after this conflict, will be the biggest and best trained armed forces in Europe. And so we need to make sure that they get the rightful place in the European security architecture. And I think that is the reason, not only because in the Bucharest summit in 2008, the leaders decided that Ukraine and Georgia would become a member of NATO, but also because of the realities. And I think it is a political discussion, primarily, whether or not a nation becomes a member. But from a military standpoint, it is important to look at the position of the Ukraine armed forces after this conflict.
It's interesting to think about the health, the military health of NATO and what this has taught us. I grew up in Canada. I remember thinking NORAD was like a couple of little stations, that everybody knew wouldn't really defend you, but it was kind of like an insurance policy. How adequately resourced was NATO prior to this? Did this really sort of turn on a light and make people realize that we need to be investing more?
Yes. And I think that started in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. It was the summit in Wales where the leaders agreed to go towards 2%. And it was because everybody understood that for too long the military, the armed forces were neglected. And because in a way people thought it wasn't necessary any longer. And I think for too long nations saw NATO as a 911. So you called a number in Brussels and
it's like your
then
insurance
someone
policy.
else would and then
Where's my
someone
fire?
else would come to the rescue. And that was the NATO response force or the VJTF, the very short response forces that we had. Very high readiness. And actually, this conflict in Ukraine, close to home, has shown that we have to be ready and that time is no longer on our side. For the participation in crisis response operations like Afghanistan and like Iraq, we decided as an alliance, are we going to participate? Are we going there? With how many forces? What is the purpose? When are we coming back? And that was all a discussion where the timelines were ours. And I think that is the big change. If you are attacked by someone, especially in an autocratic state, the timeline is theirs. So other than just refocusing on collective defense, we also need more and readier forces, a higher readiness, because once you are attacked, you don't have time to get ready for it. You need to be ready. And that is what is part of all the plans that we are working on now, and in the next summit in Vilnius we will have decisions on, I'm sure. And that is so we need more ready forces, we need more capabilities that we see that we are lacking of. We need more ammunition stockpiles, we need more stockpiles in general, because the last 30 years we were working on based on this economic idea of just in time, just enough.
Yeah.
And when
we could somehow gin it up at the moment's
notice. If you have a crisis like the pandemic, we saw in medical supplies, that was not good enough. This just in time, just enough. And in a war, it's exactly the same. There's no proper response in the present economic system to a peak demand signal.
I want to go back a second to something you said. You talked about the 911 as a mindset that had to change. Another mindset people have around war is that it's a technological, that drones and that a lot of war will be fought without human beings. Is that a perception that you think is now changing as a result of, or maybe that's...
I was the chief of defense of the Netherlands, and I was blamed that people said to me, yeah, you military guys always prepare for the last war. And the next war will be all drones, will be artificial intelligence, cyber, and it's not, the mud and blood with tanks and infantry, and it's not going to happen. So, wake up and make the right choices. What we actually see is that this war is a combination of World War I, World War II tactics, trench warfare, artillery barrages, lots of waves of soldiers being killed.
That was a tragic war with...
Yes, and then we see also the new war, which is AI, artificial intelligence, which is drones, which is quantum, not yet in that sense, but So there is a mix of old and new today, and we have to be ready for both at the same time. And I think that is difficult for a lot of nations because out of efficiency choices, people say, you have to choose. There's not a lot of money. And actually, if there is an enemy that attacks you, you sometimes don't have the luxury of that choice because you can actually have made the wrong choice.
Before I want to get to why you're here, but before that, let me ask you, you talk about a strong man, or I call it strong man politics in Russia. We're seeing that in other parts of the world, is that a concern? You're not a politician, of course, but when you see that type of, essentially, whether it's wannabe dictators, but concerns about democracy and polarization, how does that impact the effectiveness or the strategy of NATO, or does it have no impact on you? Is it just
the strategy I think is good because we now look at the reality on the ground, which is Russia and the terror groups. I think for many, many decades, a lot of people in politics talked about how they would love the world to look like, not necessarily talked about how the world looked like. And I think as a result of this war, a lot of nations, politicians have woken up to the reality that the world is not as nice and good looking as we would like it to be. Mm-hmm. And therefore the strategy that was luckily enough in place, and as a result we were ready as an alliance when the war started, because part of this deterrence and defense strategy that we had been working on already, we could use it on the 24th of February.
Yeah.
And we were able to beef up the forces from 4,000 to 40,000 in Europe within basically a couple of days. So that is the reality. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't strive for a better world, but I think we will be faced with this reality that there's autocracies and there's democracies. And unfortunately, I think we have, as the Western world and the worlds with the democracies, thought for too long that it was such a strong brand, democracy, that you actually didn't have to do anything to promote it and to market it. Because it was so good, it would market itself. And as a result of things that happened over the last decade, 15 years, for many reasons, actually, I think there is a growing number of people in the world that actually believe there is an alternative. And whether that is Russia or China, and I'm not saying they are better, but there is a lot of growing number of people that believe they are a credible alternative to what we offer.
Can we win a war of attrition? Can the
I'm
NATO...
absolutely sure we can.
Yeah.
Because we have the money, we have the intelligence, we have the brains. What we have to make sure is that we have the endurance, the resilience to do it. And it will mean sometimes that we will have to make choices, that we will have to, prioritize.
We're not doing that now?
I saw an article a couple of days ago, and it was fascinating, and it shows my point. It proves my point. It was about a defense production firm in Norway that was complaining that TikTok, which is one of these tech companies in social...
owned by China, ByteDance.
Yeah. And so they are operating in Norway as well. And they use so much energy for their servers because it's part of what they do. A lot of the social traffic on that app is going, of course, via servers. And there's so much energy used by TikTok in Norway that the electricity company said to the industry production company, we cannot supply you with enough electricity. And then I say, this is about choices. This is about focusing on the right things, given the circumstances.
One thing I have to ask you, Admiral Bauer, you are here at a conference that's mostly private sector leaders. Why?
Because I believe that we need to start the debate about the private sector becoming part of the values discussion and not just about shareholder value and long-term demand signals and I think we need to have a debate amongst each other to see that security is so essential for economic activity that the private investors start to understand that sector, the security sector, is important in itself.
So investing in it, you're not talking about that, outsourcing or private sector complements to defense. You're talking about investing in the companies that
Yes.
create cutting edge technology.
So if you are a CEO in a defense production firm, and you can say, given the orders to your shareholders, our portfolio is filled until 2035. You're a very good CEO. You will get a big bonus.
Yeah.
But the chiefs of defense of the nations that order that stuff say to your company, that's not good enough 2035. I need it actually tomorrow. And I understand that the production time for whatever I order takes longer than that, but this is not good enough 2035. But then the private investors have to accept that the dividend will go down a couple of years because of this investment. Not because it is in their interest from a money perspective, but because of the interest of our combined interest, the security. The Ukraine lost 35% of its economy when the war started.
Yeah.
The investors have lost that money as well at that time. So security is, it should be there, and everybody has expected it to be there for many decades. So there was no discussion about it. But it isn't an automatic thing. It isn't a given. So we need to make sure together that it is there again.
One other question, I hate to make it as simplistic as optimistic, pessimistic, realistic, no doubt, but there's a lot of trepidation and concern over what's the end game for Ukraine, and none of us are soothsayers. Are when you look at the apparatus that's in place from where you sit, how do you feel about it in general, about your confidence?
I'm very positive about the fact that every meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, political leaders on whatever level say we will continue to support Ukraine for as long as necessary. Mm-hmm. So that is good. Despite the different things you hear in the different nations, in the press, there is a commitment, a continued commitment. So that is very good and important. I think there is also an agreement on the fact that we cannot afford to let Russia win this war this war of Russia. It's not a war of Ukraine, it's a Russia war. They started it.
Yeah.
And as I said today, if Russia stops the war today, the war is over. If Ukraine stops the war today, they have lost their country.
Yeah.
And that is the big difference. So we need to continue. We cannot allow Russia to win. And actually, we need to make sure that Ukraine wins it. And then in what the exact outcome is, I cannot predict. But we have to make sure, because the Russian ambitions, the Russian strategic objectives have not been met at all. Therefore, they will continue. Therefore, Ukraine must continue to not only defend itself, but to retake what is theirs.
Yeah.
And that is what the spring offensive is about. That will not be a one-time thing. It will not be like a magical spring offensive that will turn the war completely. But it needs to be good, and it needs to be good enough to make sure that the Russians again find out that they cannot be successful in the longer term in Ukraine.
Admiral Bauer, thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.